Today, we become legends.
I surveyed hundreds of my audience members to find the answer to one simple question. Which are the highest and lowest skilled gods in Smite? I asked everyone who took part to rate every Smite god from 1 to 5 based on how hard or easy they are to play, with 1 being completely brain dead and 5 being galaxy brain. I then averaged out all the responses into a single number for each god. Let's take a look at that data. So first up, class averages. Here's the results. Guardians came out on top with an average score of 2.76 out of 5, very closely followed by Assassins, then a decent drop off to Mages at 2.54, followed by Hunters at 2.38, and finally Warriors as the least skilled class overall at 2.35, just behind Hunters. Moving on, let's talk about some season averages to see how Smite's god releases have fared over the years in terms of skill cap. So the most instantly noticeable takeaway from this data is that Season 6 completely knocked out of the park in terms of skill testing god releases. With a score of 3.35, they're far and away the highest season placement, clearing the second place Season 8 by more than 0.5 points. These results were dragged up quite a bit by Yamoja and Set, who scored extremely high, but honestly the entire roster of Season 6 outside of Jormungandr scored really highly here. The lowest skill roster overall came out to be closed beta, which makes sense since this includes the original 17 gods the game launched with and will have a tendency to be more simple than late releases. Year 10 actually came quite close here though with 2.31, only 0.03 points behind closed beta. Alright, moving on to single god data though. First up, let's take a look at the highest and lowest skilled gods from each class. Kicking it off with Assassins, the most skilled assassin overall was Set with an impressive score of 4.13 out of 5. The least skilled assassin is probably no surprise to anyone, and that's Arachne with a pitiful score of 1.38. For Guardians, the most skilled overall was Yamoja, which again is probably no surprise to anyone who's looked at her win rates across the ranks. She came in at a whopping 4.69 out of 5, which is pretty crazy given this data is averaged out from hundreds of responses. She also had by far the most total 5 out of 5 ratings. The least skilled Guardian is of course Bakekujira at 1.41, which might have a tiny bit of recency bias thrown in there, but even without that, Guardians were rated the most skilled class overall, but Bakekujira is definitely an outlier in how brain dead easy he is to play. Next up, Hunters. Ula took the cake for the most skilled Hunter overall with a score of 3.82 out of 5, which was surprisingly high and almost a full 0.5 above the next highest skill Hunter in Anher. The least skilled Hunter was Izanami with a score of 1.49, which does make sense given how the god basically plays itself in the laning phase. Moving on to Mages, where the most skilled is probably no surprise, and that's the Morrigan with an average score of 4.49 out of 5. Of course, this comes almost entirely from her ultimate, requiring you to know how to play most, if not all, of the gods in the game to use it to its full potential. The lowest skilled mage overall came out to be Kukulkan at 1.70, which I personally think is too low for this guy, and there are quite a few other mages I will put lower than the Noodle, but there is definitely sentiment in the community that this guy is super easy to play. And finally, the overall lowest rated class in terms of skill, the Warriors. The most skilled of them was rated to be Tia at 2.98, an interesting result, not because of the god itself, but because of how much lower this is than all the other classes' offerings for most skilled. He sits almost a full 1 point below Ula and over 1.5 points lower than Yamoja. The least skilled warrior overall came out to be Vamana at 1.49, which is really not surprising in the least. Not only is he completely brain dead in his game plan of left click W, but he's also been terrorizing the meta very recently and is fresh in people's minds as they take this survey. Alright, but let's get into the moment you've been waiting for, the top 10 most and least skilled gods in Smite according to this data. Kicking things off with the top 10 least skilled, here's the list. A lot of these make complete sense to me, especially the bottom 4, which sit noticeably lower than the rest at below 1.5 out of 5. Neith rounds out the top 10 least skilled, which is definitely an expected result. She's probably the first thing that comes to mind when someone says noob god, but does have some skill requirement in using the ultimate effectively, so it doesn't take a lower placement on the list. Martikaros is actually a similar story, with his kit being extremely simple to use, but does have that one skill testing aspect with the bushes. Wukong being here is sensible too. He's probably the safest god in the entire game and is very hard to punish, even if he makes constant mistakes. His abilities are extremely easy to hit, and the only semblance of skill required is choosing the right form on his 3. Chak is similar, just a very basic kit with nothing too much to think about other than hitting your buttons. Nuwa makes sense as well, but honestly is a little bit lower than I would have expected. She is extremely easy, don't get me wrong, but her lack of true mobility does require you to position yourself a little more carefully than some other mages, but I guess the ult sort of solves that for you. I've talked about Kukulkan already, and I don't think he should be bottom 5 on this list given his lack of true mobility and somewhat difficult skill shots compared to other mages, but he does make the bottom 5 on this list. Izanami makes complete sense given she basically plays herself for the entire early game. Vamana is an obvious obvious one as well. His base kit is extremely simple, and his ultimate is literally just press it and hold left click W for the win. Not much skill to that. Bake is another left click to win god, but has the extra factor of being extremely tanky, which makes him more forgiving. And finally, Arachne takes the overall lowest skill god spot, which is once again a hold left click W and win for freestyle god. Interestingly, Bakasura didn't make the bottom 10 despite being very similar to these bottom 4. He actually took the number 12 spot. But with that covered, let's move into the top 10 highest skill gods in Smite according to this data. Serket comes in first, just making the list at number 10. This does make sense given hitting her double madness is one of the hardest skill shots in the game, but I do think she's a tad overrated here. Janus took the number 12 spot, but I think he should have been here in place of Serket. Cleaner is at number 9, which I do agree with. Her lack of lockdown CC means placing her abilities correctly and or waiting for CC from your team is really important. And of course, the wall mechanics are very hard to use to their full potential, and are something completely unique to her which won't transfer over in terms of skill from other gods you've played. Maui hits the number 8 spot, which I do agree with again. If anything, I think he should be a little higher here. He's a very unorthodox kit with the ones needing to be set up beforehand, which requires forethought and good game sense to know when it'll be needed rather than just reacting to something happening and having it come out immediately. Using the 2 effectively is a thing of beauty when you can take your teammates that don't have jumps over walls to save them or engage on the enemy team. And of course, his ult is not only hard to hit in general, but you also have to think about the placement more so than usual to make use of the island to trap enemies after the fact. Glad to see Maui make the top 10, but I personally would have placed him even higher. Terra takes the number 7 spot, which I do think is a little overrated. She's definitely not harder than Maui in my opinion, but there are plenty of skill testing elements in her kit. And she has a very unorthodox ultimate that is hard to get value out of, but if you do, it's extremely powerful. Tiamat comes in at number 6, which makes complete sense. Being a stance switcher already puts a little extra burden on playing her since you need to know 8 abilities rather than 4. But each of those abilities are also more complex than your typical god, whereas normally stance switchers have more simple abilities individually to compensate for how many they have. Tiamat is not like this at all, as you can choose between 3 summons for her flying ult. She has her fair share of unique targeters or mechanics, like her flying 1 and 2, consuming buffs, the whole hard and scale stuff, completely changing her playstyle when in ground stance. If anything, Tiamat is a little underrated at number 6, and definitely demands a lot from her pilot to be used effectively. Breaking the top 5 most skilled gods, we have Awilix, who I definitely agree with being so high. Unlike Tiamat, Awilix's abilities themselves are actually fairly simple. Her depth and skill comes from how you use them. The immunity frames on Feather Step, clever positioning to get knockups from the 3, pulling from very short knockups with her ult, squeezing in extra autos as you pull from higher knockups in melee range with her ult, knowing when to stay mounted and when to jump from Suku and put it on cooldown. There's definitely a lot that goes into playing Awilix effectively, and while I do think she isn't quite as hard as Tiamat or Maui, she definitely deserves to be in the top 10 somewhere. At number 4 we have Ula, which I was very surprised by. Don't get me wrong, Ula is fairly hard to play, but in my opinion nowhere near top 4 hardest in the game. For my own list, he probably wouldn't even make the top 10 to be honest. Sure, rapid stance changing and ability management is hard on him, and he definitely has some of the highest APM plays of any god in the game. And hitting axe is pretty hard to do consistently at far ranges as well, but I really don't think all of that adds up to Ula being harder than the likes of Maui, Tiamat, or Awilix. If you took part in this survey and rated Ula highly, please do let me know down below why you personally think he's so hard to play. Maybe there's something I'm missing here. The top 3 are definitely a cut above the rest here, with Set starting it off. I always have problems putting why Set is difficult into words, but I think anyone who's tried to play him just knows. You have to be very careful and selective with when you go all in using the ult, and of course angling skewers to hit as many people as possible is hard to do, but I really do have a hard time explaining why Set is so skill testing, but I do agree that he should be here as someone who's tried to learn him in the past and given up pretty quickly. At number 2 we have Morrigan, who is of course purely here because of her ultimate, that in theory at least requires you to master every god in the game to use to its fullest potential, making her skill ceiling damn near infinite. Of course, in reality, you probably just need 1 or 2 good transforms that you know to a good enough level on your team or the enemy team to make good use of this ability, but there's always that potential of maximizing this, and always having the perfect transform for the situation that makes her theoretically an infinite skill ceiling god, even if her skill floor is actually not the highest in the game by any means. And finally, the number 1 most skilled god in the entire game, and probably no surprise to anyone, is Yamoja, taking the top spot with a crazy 4.66 this 9 out of 5. Of course, Omi management is one of the big things that separates a new Yamoja from a master, but there's also plenty of things with her abilities themselves that make her hard as well. Her 1 has weird unique targeters and timing on both forms that take a while to get used to properly. Using her 3 to save allies or trap enemies is something that's really hard to get a handle on, and of course using her ultimate in the jungle to get true cages using terrain walls and or her 3 to completely trap enemies is extremely skill testing. You'll immediately notice the difference between even an average Yamoja and a master of the character, and I think that really shows in this ranking. 100% deserved. But that's all I've got for this video. What are your personal thoughts? Do you agree with the masses for the most part, or are there some picks here that completely baffle you like Kukulkan did for me? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.